It was a humid afternoon in New York, the kind that made the air feel heavier with each passing hour. Inside a private conference room overlooking the East River, two very different worlds were about to collide. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat Donald Trump, leaning back in his chair, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. On the other side, upright and composed, was President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, his posture unshaken, his gaze fixed. The meeting was meant to be informal, a casual discussion about trade and cooperation, but from the moment the two entered the room, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Trump broke the silence first. "We can break you," he said, his voice a mixture of confidence and warning. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. His tone wasn't just about economics or politics, it was a statement of dominance, the kind he had delivered to countless leaders before. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table, and replied, "You can't break what you don't own." The room went silent. For a brief second, even the air seemed to stop moving. A small shift in Trump's expression betrayed surprise. He wasn't used to being answered like that. From that moment, the discussion turned into a duel, not of weapons, but of words and principles. Trump tried to frame his statement in the language of protection and partnership, hinting that without U.S. influence, Burkina Faso would crumble under the weight of global pressures. But Traoré countered each remark with calm precision, speaking of African self-sufficiency, independence, and the dangers of mistaking foreign aid for ownership. Through the window, the skyline of New York glittered as if unaware of the history unfolding in that room. What began as a diplomatic courtesy was quickly becoming a battle of narratives, one man defending a century-old system of power, and the other determined to prove that its time had ended. Trump's smirk deepened, but his eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to resistance, especially not from someone he considered a political newcomer. "You think you can stand alone?" he asked, his tone shifting from casual arrogance to a sharp edge. "The world runs on alliances, and those alliances run on power. And power," he paused for effect, "is something we've had for a long time." Traoré didn't avert his gaze. "Power is not ownership," he said calmly. "It's the illusion that control is permanent. Africa has been told for decades that it can't stand without foreign hands holding it up. But if you've built your influence on dependency, then what happens when we refuse to depend?" The air in the room thickened. Trump leaned forward now, elbows on the table, voice low but forceful. "Refuse all you want, but when your economy shakes, when the pressure comes, you'll find yourself back at the table, on my terms." Traoré tilted his head slightly, a faint smile crossing his lips. "If the table is yours, then maybe we need to build our own. You can't break what you don't own, Mr. Trump. And Burkina Faso doesn't belong to anyone." There was a brief silence. In that pause, the sound of traffic from the streets below seemed louder, a reminder that beyond this room, life went on. But here, the conversation was no longer about one country, it was about an entire continent's refusal to play by old rules. Trump tried to pivot, invoking mutual benefits and economic partnerships, but the undertone remained, control disguised as cooperation. Traoré countered with examples of local agricultural programs, regional alliances within West Africa, and a vision of trade that didn't require bending to the will of a superpower. Every sentence from Traoré chipped away at the assumption that U.S. influence was inevitable. And every response from Trump carried a trace more frustration, as though the usual pressure tactics weren't working. Trump's tone sharpened, the measured diplomacy from earlier replaced by the blunt force he was known for. "You're talking big now," he said, pointing a finger across the table, "but when the markets close in on you, when investors pull out, when sanctions start piling up, let's see how long you last. Everyone has a breaking point, Traoré." The words were deliberate, almost a dare. For Trump, power was proven by watching opponents bend under economic pressure. He had seen it before, leaders who spoke defiantly in public but folded in private when the screws tightened. Traoré, however, wasn't leaning back in defeat, he was leaning in. A breaking point exists only if you're trapped in someone else's system, he replied evenly. Our markets are not yours. Our alliances are not yours. And our survival does not depend on your approval. Trump scoffed, shaking his head. That's cute. But the global economy is my system. It's America's system. Every deal, every market, if we want to, we can shut the doors. The Burkinabe president's eyes narrowed, but his tone remained calm. Then maybe we stop knocking on your doors and start building our own. That's the part you can't seem to understand. This isn't about rejecting cooperation, it's about rejecting control. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. Both men knew the stakes had moved beyond bilateral politics. Trump's warning wasn't just a threat to Burkina Faso, it was a signal to anyone thinking of stepping out of Washington's shadow. And Traoré's refusal to back down was an equally clear message: the age of unchallenged dominance was ending. Outside the conference room, aides exchanged tense glances. Inside, the table felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the world beyond was holding its breath for whichever man would speak next. Trump leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face, but his words were sharpened like a blade. You know, I've met a lot of leaders who talk tough, he began, his voice dripping with condescension. They make speeches, wave flags, and shout about independence, but when the money runs out, they come crawling back. Every single time. He tapped the table with his index finger for emphasis. I've seen it. And you, Traoré, you'll be no different. The jab wasn't just political, it was personal. The implication was clear: Traoré's defiance was a performance, a temporary stance until reality humbled him. Traoré's face remained unreadable, but there was a subtle tightening in his jaw. You speak as if the only measure of a leader is how quickly he bows to wealth, he said. If your vision of strength is bending for money, then we do not share the same definition of leadership. Trump chuckled dismissively. Leadership is winning. And winning means control, resources, markets, narratives. Without that, you're just another loud voice in the room. Traoré leaned forward, his tone precise, each word deliberate. Control is not the same as respect. And the world you describe, where a few nations hold the pen and everyone else signs at the bottom, that world is dying. You don't see it yet, because you've lived too long in a room where everyone agrees with you. For a moment, Trump's grin faltered, replaced by a narrowed glare. He was used to verbal dominance, to opponents breaking their rhythm under his jabs. But Traoré wasn't breaking, he was countering with a calm intensity that made Trump's threats feel heavier, less certain. Outside the window, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the table. It was a fitting backdrop, two figures locked in a struggle not just over policies, but over the future balance of power itself. Word of the heated exchange didn't stay behind closed doors for long. Someone in the corridor had caught fragments of the conversation: Trump's warning, Traoré's sharp reply, and within hours, whispers reached the press. By evening, social media was buzzing with quotes that seemed almost too bold to be real. You can't break what you don't own. The phrase was already trending on Twitter, plastered over images of Traoré in military uniform, standing tall against a backdrop of Burkina Faso's flag. In contrast, Trump's "we can break you" was being shared with a mix of outrage and admiration, depending on which corner of the internet you looked at. International news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a symbolic clash between old-world dominance and a rising new voice from Africa. Commentators debated whether Traoré's defiance was reckless or revolutionary. African analysts praised him for breaking the usual script, refusing to let Western leaders dictate the tone of the conversation. Back in the conference room, the atmosphere had shifted. Trump's aides were uneasy, aware that the optics had turned. A private warning was now a global headline, and every further word could either escalate or defuse the situation. Trump glanced at his phone, scanning a news alert, and muttered, "They're making you into some kind of hero." Traoré met his gaze without hesitation. I don't need to be a hero. I just need my people to know I didn't bow. It was the kind of statement that resonated far beyond New York. In Ouagadougou, young men and women gathered around radios and smartphones, listening to updates and sharing the story. In other African capitals, leaders were quietly taking note. What had started as a tense meeting between two men was turning into a symbolic moment for an entire continent, one that neither could fully control anymore. Within 24 hours, the exchange had exploded into a full-blown international story. Major networks from CNN to Al Jazeera ran looping segments of analysts dissecting every line, every expression, every subtle shift in tone between Trump and Traoré. The confrontation was now more than a political disagreement, it had become a cultural flashpoint. In Africa, the reaction was electric. Editorials in Nairobi, Lagos, and Dakar praised Traoré's refusal to bow under verbal pressure, framing it as a watershed moment in the narrative of African agency. Hashtags like #NoTown and #StandTallAfrica began trending across multiple countries. In Ouagadougou, murals appeared overnight depicting Traoré standing unflinching before a shadowy figure meant to represent Western power. In Washington, however, the mood was different. Congressional hawks criticized Trump for letting a regional leader embarrass the United States, while others argued that engaging in a verbal showdown only amplified Traoré's influence. Think tanks began releasing op-eds warning that America's traditional grip on African alliances was loosening faster than anticipated. Trump's own media allies tried to spin the narrative, portraying Traoré as reckless and inexperienced, but the viral clips of him delivering his calm, cutting replies were proving hard to counter. The optics favored him. Trump came off aggressive, Traoré came off principled. Even European capitals were weighing in. In Paris, some commentators saw the moment as a signal that France's waning influence in West Africa was part of a larger geopolitical shift. In Berlin, a foreign policy panel debated whether the U.S. approach had just handed China and Russia an opening to deepen their ties in the region. What had been a tense, closed-door meeting had morphed into a global test case for 21st-century diplomacy. And the world was still watching, waiting to see who would make the next move. Trump wasn't the kind of man to let a narrative slip away without a fight. By the next morning, his team was in full damage control mode. A flurry of phone calls went out to allied leaders, media surrogates, and business partners. The goal was simple: reframe the clash not as a humiliation, but as a wake-up call about unreliable partners in Africa. Behind closed doors, he instructed his advisors to prepare a package of measures designed to pressure Burkina Faso without making it look like outright retaliation. These included enhanced trade reviews, tightened access to certain financial channels, and whispers to multinational corporations that it might be time to reconsider their investments. But Traoré was no stranger to this kind of playbook. Before the measures could even be formally announced, he took to the podium in Ouagadougou. The speech was short, but it struck directly at the heart of Trump's strategy. Power, he said, is not the ability to punish, it is the ability to inspire loyalty. If your partnerships depend on fear, they are not partnerships at all. That line hit international headlines almost instantly. It reframed the conversation again, making Trump's actions look heavy-handed and desperate. In response, Trump doubled down, booking an exclusive primetime interview in which he described Traoré as a young leader making dangerous mistakes and warned that history won't be kind to him. But the optics didn't help. Clips of Trump's stern warnings were played alongside footage of cheering crowds in Burkina Faso waving homemade signs that read, "Not owned, not broken." What was intended as a pressure campaign was morphing into a public relations boomerang. Every attempt to rein in Traoré's defiance seemed only to amplify his image as a symbol of resistance. The shockwaves from the Trump-Traoré clash were no longer contained to the US and Burkina Faso. Across the African Union, leaders were privately reassessing the cost of aligning too closely with Washington. In capitals from Addis Ababa to Pretoria, foreign ministries were quietly drafting memos. What does it mean if a smaller nation can openly defy the United States and emerge more popular than before? In West Africa, the reaction was especially pronounced. Mali's interim leadership issued a statement praising any leader who stands for sovereignty without compromise. Guinea's government released a video montage of Traoré's quotes, framing them as words for all Africans. Even Nigeria's press, often careful about taking sides, was running opinion pieces suggesting that the US's old leverage might be eroding faster than anticipated. China and Russia, meanwhile, were quick to seize the narrative. State media in both countries ran glowing profiles of Traoré, painting him as proof that the global South was shaking off Western dominance. Russian commentators compared his rhetoric to Cold War-era defiance, while Chinese outlets highlighted Burkina Faso's push for self-sufficiency as a model for development without conditional aid. Inside the U.S. diplomatic corps, unease was growing. Ambassadors in African capitals reported that their usual channels of influence were suddenly harder to activate. Meetings were polite, but there was a new edge. Officials who once deferred to U.S. positions were now openly citing Burkina Faso's example in negotiations. For Trump, this was becoming a dangerous precedent. If Traoré could turn a verbal confrontation into a symbol of dignity and independence, others might follow, and that would mean a fundamental shift in how Washington wielded power on the continent. But for Traoré, it was never just about scoring points in a political game. To him, this was about planting a flag, one that signaled, to every African watching, that the future didn't have to be negotiated in someone else's office. The confrontation had shifted from a single exchange into a long-term chess match. Both Trump and Traoré now understood that the next move could redefine the balance of influence, not just between two men, but between two very different visions of leadership. At Mar-a-Lago, Trump gathered a small circle of advisors, avoiding the usual noise of his wider political network. He wanted strategies that would hurt without looking like retaliation. Economic levers were discussed, restricting aid to Burkina Faso's regional partners, quietly lobbying multinational lenders to re-evaluate credit lines, and offering incentives to African leaders willing to distance themselves from Traoré. But his political instincts told him something deeper. This wasn't just about sanctions or leverage. It was about image. If Traoré's defiance continued to inspire across Africa, it could erode the US's prestige in ways money couldn't quickly fix. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré convened his own council, not of high-powered consultants, but of regional allies and community leaders. His focus was on reinforcing the grassroots. He doubled investment in local agriculture programs, expanded training for young entrepreneurs, and launched an initiative to increase trade within West Africa itself. If we can stand on our own feet, he told them, we can walk anywhere we choose. Intelligence briefings warned Traoré that economic pressure might be coming, possibly disguised as market corrections or policy reviews. His answer was calm: prepare backup trade routes, strengthen ties with non-Western markets, and make every public appearance a message of unshakable resolve. Both leaders knew the next face-to-face meeting, whenever it came, would not be cordial. It would be a duel of narratives, each man fighting to prove his version of strength to the watching world. The summit hall in Addis Ababa was silent except for the hum of cameras. World leaders, diplomats, and journalists had gathered for what had been billed as a strategic cooperation dialogue, but everyone knew why they were really there: to witness the next Trump-Traoré exchange. The two men entered from opposite sides of the stage. Trump's expression was firm, eyes narrowed, his trademark confidence radiating like a shield. Traoré walked with a calm, deliberate stride, shoulders squared, gaze steady, as if carrying not just himself but the weight of an entire continent's expectations. The moderator barely finished the opening question before Trump leaned forward. "We can still work together," he began, "but let me be clear, those who push too far against us often regret it." His words were measured but laced with warning. Traoré's reply came without pause. "Those who fear independence," he said evenly, "often mistake it for defiance. We do not exist to please you, Mr. Trump, we exist to serve our people." The crowd stirred, sensing the tension rising. Trump smirked slightly, as if preparing his final blow. We can break you, he said. The line hung heavy in the air. Traoré didn't blink. He leaned in just enough for his voice to cut through the room without needing to raise it. You can't break what you don't own. The silence was deafening. Then, a ripple of applause, quiet at first, then swelling until it filled the hall. Cameras caught every angle, Trump's tight jaw, Traoré's composed gaze, the delegates exchanging knowing glances. Within minutes, the clip was flooding social media. Across Africa, it was being replayed with pride. In Washington, it was dissected with unease. In that single moment, the duel of words had reached its peak, and the message was unmistakable. This was not just a leader standing up to a man, but a continent standing up to a legacy. Leadership isn't measured by how many nations you can bend to your will, but by how many you can inspire to stand on their own. We are not here to be owned, controlled, or shaped into someone else's image. We are here to write our own history, on our own terms. If cooperation comes with respect, our doors will always be open. But if it comes with chains, we will break them every time. This is not defiance for the sake of defiance, it is dignity for the sake of our children. And no matter how loud the threats, no matter how powerful the opponent, the truth remains, you cannot break what you do not own. Burkina Faso stands. Africa stands. And we will keep standing, taller than ever.